the orphan who entered Hitler's shadow. What if the last man to stand inside Hitler's bunker didn't begin life surrounded by privilege or influence at all? What if he was just a boy orphaned early, shaped by war long before he ever carried a weapon? Rochus Misch's journey to the center of history began not with politics or power, but with loss. He was born in 1917 in Silesia, a quiet region on the shifting frontiers of Germany and Poland. From the very beginning, war defined his existence. His father never returned from the First World War, one of the millions swallowed by the slaughter of the trenches. His mother died soon after. Before Rochus could form his first clear memories, before he even knew what it meant to belong to a family, he had none. He was an orphan in a broken country. Raised by his grandparents, Misch grew up in a Germany that was staggering under the humiliation of defeat. The Treaty of Versailles had left the nation crippled. The economy collapsed. Millions of men, young and old, searched desperately for work, for belonging, for some reason to carry on. In the towns and villages, boys like Rochus saw not stability but hunger, bitterness, and anger. He was not a politician, not a thinker, just another young man shaped by his country's wounds. For boys like him, identity did not come from books or ideology. It came from uniforms, from flags, from marching songs that promised purpose where none seemed to exist. By the time he was in his early 20s, Misch joined the Schutzstaffel, the SS. In later years, he insisted it wasn't ideology that pulled him in. He described himself as a soldier, nothing more. For him, the black uniform meant identity, belonging, survival. It gave him a place in a world where so many had none. But history has a way of pulling ordinary men into extraordinary places. Misch didn't know it yet, but the path he had chosen would take him directly into the shadows of power. At first, his duties were simple. He performed guard shifts, courier work, the mundane assignments given to junior men in the ranks. He was one of thousands, a cog in the machinery of the SS. But proximity is dangerous. The closer you move to the center, the harder it becomes to escape. Through a combination of chance, discipline, and loyalty, Misch was selected for one of the most exclusive posts in Nazi Germany, the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the Führer's personal guard unit. It was an assignment that would change his life forever. At first, he was still a guard at the periphery. He stood post outside headquarters, carried messages between offices, and ran errands for officers. He was not yet inside Hitler's innermost circle, but being in the orbit of power meant that every day, every task, carried weight. It meant his footsteps echoed in the same corridors as the men who were rewriting Europe. Soon, Misch's reliability set him apart. He wasn't flashy, wasn't ideological, wasn't ambitious. He was disciplined, steady, discreet, the kind of man superiors could trust to be invisible. And in a regime built on secrecy and control, invisibility was a rare and valuable trait. Bit by bit, his duties brought him closer to Hitler's world. He was trained to operate the complex telephone systems that connected Hitler's offices to the front lines. He carried sealed messages from generals to staff. And eventually, he found himself stationed not at a distance, but inside the Führer's headquarters, where Adolf Hitler lived, worked, and plotted the war. Misch would later write in his memoir, The Last Witness, about his first impressions of Hitler. To him, the Führer wasn't the fiery orator broadcast to the masses. He wasn't the raging fanatic the world would come to know. Instead, Hitler seemed quiet, almost withdrawn, a boss, as Misch described him. Strict, reserved, but not harsh with his staff. Hitler rarely raised his voice in those private rooms. He kept to himself, spoke little, and expected discipline. To Misch, the Führer was not a monster in human skin. He was an employer, a figure of control. It unsettled him later to realize how ordinary his presence had seemed. But this is what makes Misch's testimony both haunting and disturbing. For him, this was never ideology. It was duty. He didn't question orders. He didn't debate politics. He followed the chain of command like countless other soldiers. Yet, unlike the millions who served on distant battlefields, Rochus Misch's post placed him at the very heart of the Reich. He stood in the rooms where history was being written. He walked through the corridors where decisions of conquest and destruction were made. He was there in the moments the public never saw, the quiet evenings, the silent meals, the endless phone calls. And through it all, he thought of himself as nothing more than a cog in the machine. Looking back years later, Misch insisted he never thought of himself as a participant in great events. He said he was simply present, a bodyguard, a courier, an operator, someone whose job was to guard, to listen, to carry out orders. But that position, that proximity, made him a silent witness to private moments no one else would ever see. This was the paradox of Rochus Misch's life. He was a man who never considered himself important, yet he stood closer to Adolf Hitler than almost anyone else. He saw the dictator not at rallies or parades, but in the hidden rooms where he lived his daily life. Not fire and fury, but silence and routine. The world would later see Hitler as a figure of monstrous power, a symbol of cruelty and destruction. But Rochus Misch, the orphan from Silesia, saw something different. He saw a man of routines, a figure who carried himself with obsessive control. He saw the private life of a dictator, the life behind the speeches, behind the ideology, behind the fire. And that was the beginning of Misch's journey. A boy with no family, no privilege, no ideology, had been pulled into Hitler's shadow. By chance, by discipline, and by the momentum of history itself, he had become a witness to the most secret moments of the Third Reich. But this was only the beginning. The deeper he went, the more he would see, and the closer he moved to the man he guarded, the more he would realize that power, when stripped of speeches and spectacle, often looks disturbingly ordinary. That was Rochus Misch's world, a world not of politics or speeches, but of corridors, telephones, and silent duty. And it was a world that would carry him all the way to the end, into the bunker where Hitler's empire finally collapsed. Inside Hitler's private world, by the early 1940s, Rochus Misch was no longer just another guard standing post outside Hitler's doors. He had become part of the Führer's personal staff, a courier, a telephone operator, and above all, a silent observer in Adolf Hitler's most private world. To the outside world, Hitler was the firebrand who mesmerized crowds, the fanatic who roared in speeches and commanded armies across Europe. But inside his headquarters, the man Rochus Misch served was different. He was bound not by rage, but by routine. And it was those routines that Misch remembered most clearly. Hitler's daily patterns. In his memoir, The Last Witness, Misch describes a man almost obsessed with precision. Hitler's days were structured down to the smallest detail. Breakfast arrived at the same hour every morning. Simple vegetarian meals, rolls, fruit, porridge, tea. No alcohol, no coffee, never meat. Misch remembered that these habits were not luxuries, but patterns repeated day after day, year after year. Lunch was punctual too. Rice, vegetables, fruit compote. Dinner was equally plain. Nothing indulgent, nothing spontaneous. In Misch's eyes, this was not the picture of a dictator feasting on the spoils of war, but of a man who clung obsessively to order in a world spiraling into chaos. Evenings were reserved for Hitler's private cinema. Misch recalled reels of comedies, romances, newsreels, and even nature documentaries. For hours, Hitler and his small circle sat in the dark, watching film after film. The Führer, who ruled nations by days, spent his nights absorbed in moving pictures. Escapes into other lives while millions suffered outside those walls. Later, there might be quiet walks, subdued conversations, or time with his beloved German shepherd, Blondie. Misch saw these patterns so often they became normal to him, the routines of a boss rather than the mania of a tyrant. And yet, that ordinariness is what unsettles the reader today. Because outside those doors, Europe was burning. Armies marched, cities fell, millions were deported, enslaved, and murdered. But inside, Misch saw calmness, not chaos, tea and films, not fire and fury. The inner circle, Misch's vantage point, gave him glimpses of Hitler's closest associates, men who shaped the Nazi regime and whose personalities dominated the bunker corridors. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, was ever present. Misch remembered his passion, his quick temper, the sharpness of his words. Goebbels carried himself like a man aflame with energy, always calculating, always persuasive. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, appeared less frequently in Misch's orbit but left an impression of coldness. He was distant, methodical, unsettling even to staff who rarely interacted with him. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, was a shadow in the background. Misch recalled him as feared and disliked by almost everyone. He controlled access to Hitler, filtered documents, and wielded enormous unseen power. Staff knew that nothing reached the Führer without passing through Bormann's hands. And then there was Eva Braun. To the German public, she barely existed, kept hidden from the spotlight. But to Misch, she was a daily presence, cheerful, playful, almost girlish in her demeanor. She laughed easily, made small talk with the staff, and brightened rooms that otherwise felt heavy with tension. In the evenings, she sat at Hitler's side, easing the atmosphere with light conversation and charm. Misch remembered her as the most human figure in Hitler's private world, a reminder of normality amid darkness. Her presence didn't make Hitler sympathetic. It made him more terrifying, because it showed how the most destructive man of the century lived surrounded not just by generals and secretaries, but by warmth, by intimacy, by love. A silent witness, Misch was never part of this circle. He stood on the edge, the man at the phone switchboard, the courier running sealed envelopes, the bodyguard at the corridor's end. He didn't debate strategy. He didn't challenge orders. He didn't take part in decision-making, but his vantage point was extraordinary. He was the quiet presence in the background of meetings where generals brought bad news from the front. He saw Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl enter Hitler's office carrying maps, their voices careful as defeats piled higher. Misch remembered the silence that followed those reports, the shifting of papers, the weight of every word. Hitler didn't rage in those moments, not in front of staff like Misch. Instead, he paced. He listened. His face hardened. His voice remained calm. He leaned heavily on Bormann, who whispered suggestions and managed the flow of documents. Misch, watching from the sidelines, realized the Führer's control wasn't just in his speeches, but in his silence. The private Hitler, the one behind closed doors, was not the screaming dictator of propaganda films. He was quiet, methodical, withdrawn. And that quietness was more chilling than fury. The weight of normality. What haunts Misch's testimony is not revelations of secret policies or inside plots. He never claimed to have that kind of knowledge. What haunts is the ordinariness of what he saw. He described Hitler's strict politeness with staff, his reserved manner, his insistence on routine even as the world crumbled outside. Misch recalled Eva Braun bringing lightness to rooms, Goebbels whispering strategies to maintain morale, and staff laughing quietly during film nights. These details jar against the image of a man who ordered destruction on a continental scale. They remind us that history's darkest figures do not always appear monstrous in private. Sometimes they are disturbingly human. This tension, the gap between the private and the public face of Hitler, is what makes Misch's account both valuable and unsettling. He didn't describe ideology. He didn't dwell on crimes. He described routines, meals, conversations, silences. And in those fragments, we glimpse how power hides itself in normality. History's criticism. Historians have often criticized Misch for portraying Hitler in such restrained terms. They argue he whitewashed, that he deliberately ignored the brutality, that he claimed ignorance of atrocities he must have known about. Misch always maintained he was not ideological. He said he was a soldier, a guard, a messenger. He lived in a bubble of orders and routines. To some, this sounds like denial. To others, it highlights how the Nazi system functioned. By compartmentalization, by encouraging men like Misch to see themselves not as participants, but as functionaries, cogs who never questioned the larger machine. But whatever the case, Misch's memories remain important because they show us the contrast. They show us that Hitler was not only the roaring figure on podiums, but also the quiet man pacing in his office, the boss who sipped tea and watched comedies while Europe burned. For Rochus Misch, this was life. Not a front-line battlefield, not a grand office of command, but the hidden corridors of Hitler's private world. He was there for the silences, the routines, the fragments of normality that made the dictator appear disturbingly ordinary. And that was the most unsettling part, because it revealed that evil is not always marked by fury or violence. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it drinks tea, watches films, and moves through life with meticulous calmness. Misch never thought of himself as important, but his vantage point gave him a rare view into the daily life of Adolf Hitler, a view that reveals as much about the nature of power as any battlefield or speech ever could. What he didn't yet know was that this world of routines would not last forever. As the war turned against Germany, the rooms where he once watched quiet meals and evening films would become darker, more claustrophobic. And eventually, they would transform into the bunker where Hitler's empire collapsed. That was where Misch's silent witness would become history. The bunker, Hitler's world collapses by 1945. The world that Rochus Misch had quietly served for years was shrinking into concrete walls. The Grand Reich Chancellery above ground was battered by bombs. Berlin itself was breaking apart, its streets reduced to rubble, its civilians fleeing in terror. And beneath it all, in a fortified labyrinth of steel and concrete, Adolf Hitler made his last stand. For Rochus Misch, who had begun as a guard and risen to become Hitler's courier and telephone operator, this was the final chapter of his service. He was no longer pacing polished corridors or carrying messages between offices. He was in the Führerbunker, a subterranean tomb that reeked of sweat, smoke, and despair. The descent into the bunker wasn't glamorous. Misch remembered it as dim, cramped, and claustrophobic. The walls sweated with damp. The hum of ventilation fans was constant. The air was stale, heavy with cigarette smoke and the odor of unwashed uniforms. Maps covered the walls in every office. Pins and markers tracked divisions that no longer existed, front lines that had collapsed days earlier. Every update brought worse news. Above ground, the Soviet Red Army was closing in. Their artillery shook the city night after night. Dust drifted down from the ceiling with every strike. The bunker trembled like a coffin under bombardment. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Soldiers, secretaries, and aides moved quietly, their faces pale and hollow. Sleep was rare. Food was scarce. Conversations were clipped, whispered, and always circled back to the same grim truth: Germany was lost. Misch at the switchboard. Misch's post was the communications switchboard, a small room with wires and dials that connected the bunker to what remained of the outside world. Every ring of the phone carried the weight of a collapsing empire. Generals called with updates from crumbling fronts. Civil administrators begged for orders. Allies reported defections or silence. Misch was the man who connected those voices, who heard the fragments of a Reich in freefall. He